tonight, we're climbing up into the cloud-damp halls of Mount Olympus, that drafty marble penthouse in the sky, where the floors are always a little slick with spilled nectar, and the host of the party is a middle-aged thunder god with a wandering eye and a wife who notices everything. You've arrived late. The good couches are taken. Somewhere off in the haze there's the low rumble of someone important being annoyed, and you can't tell yet if it's weather or a marriage. This is the story of who Zeus loved, or pursued, or charmed, or descended upon in a shape no reasonable person would expect, depending on which lover we're talking about and which poet was writing it down. There are a great many of them. We're going to go through them slowly, one at a time. If a calm voice walking through old myths while you fall asleep is the kind of thing you like, a like helps the channel, and subscribing means the next one finds you. And if you'd leave a comment with where you are and what time it is there right now. I always like reading them in the morning. Now, dim the lights or switch them off. Get comfortable. Here's the thing I want you to wonder about as we go. Why did the king of the gods, who could do anything, so often arrive as a bird? Who was the woman who got turned into a cow over a misunderstanding, and how long did she walk like that? Which of these lovers was a man, and why does nobody ever mention him? What happened to the children, all those half-divine kids scattered across the Greek world like loose change? Why did one queen spend her entire immortal life furious, and was she wrong to be? And who, in the end, got the worst of it, the god or the people he came down for? Let's begin where these things always begin, with a marriage that was already complicated. You've just woken up in a version of the ancient world where the weather has opinions. The sky is a person. He has a name, Zeus, and a temper, and a long memory for slights and an extremely short one for promises. He's married to Hera, who is his sister, which the Greeks found completely normal, and we're simply going to move past. Their wedding, by some accounts, lasted 300 years. Picture the catering bill. Hera is the goddess of marriage. Sit with the irony of that for a moment, because she certainly did for eternity. She presides over weddings and wives and the sacred promises between them, and she is bound for all time to the single most unfaithful husband in the entire imagination of an entire civilization. It's a bit like making the world's most committed vegetarian the patron saint of the sausage festival. She did not ask for this. She got it anyway. Their courtship before the marrying tells you everything. Zeus wanted her. Hera was not interested. So he did the thing he would go on to do for the rest of recorded myth, which is change his shape to get close to someone who'd said no. He turned himself into a small bird, a cuckoo specifically, bedraggled and shivering, caught out in a storm he had personally arranged. Hera, who was kind to small cold things, picked the little bird up and held it to her chest to warm it. You can guess the rest. The bird was not a bird, so that is the beginning. That is the foundation the whole marriage is built on. A trick involving a disguise and a woman being nicer than the situation deserved, and you should keep it in mind because it is the template. Almost everything that follows is a variation on that first cold cuckoo. He just kept finding new animals. After they married, the trouble didn't stop, it multiplied. And Hera, who could not punish a god she was bound to, found other targets for all that justified fury, which is the quietly sad engine under this entire story. The lightning never landed where it deserved to. Hold on to Hera, she's our recurring weather system. Every section from here has her somewhere in the background, watching, counting, remembering. She never sleeps, even when you do. Now let's meet the first of the mortals foolish enough to be beautiful near him. Her name was Io, and she was a priestess. Specifically, she was a priestess of Hera, which is the kind of detail that would be too cruel if a novelist invented it, but is just sitting there in the actual myth, daring you to find it funny. She served Hera. She tended Hera's temple. And Zeus looked at her and decided she was next. Io started having dreams, voices in the night telling her to go out to the meadows by the river, that the king of the gods desired her. She told her father. Her father, sensibly alarmed, sent to the oracles to ask what to do, and the answer that came back was essentially send her away or it gets worse for everyone. So Io was cast out of her own home to wander, which is a thing that happens to a lot of these women, this getting thrown out of safety for a crime that was done to them rather than by them. Keep an eye on that pattern too. It recurs. Zeus found her in the meadow, and because he knew Hera missed nothing, he wrapped the whole region in a thick dark cloud. A great smothering fog rolled out across the countryside in the middle of a clear afternoon, so that no one could see what was happening underneath it. Which, if you are the goddess of marriage and you're looking down from Olympus and you see a suspicious localized cloud bank appear over exactly one meadow on an otherwise cloudless day, is not subtle. It is the opposite of subtle. It is a man hiding a birthday cake behind his back while standing in an empty room. Hera came down to investigate. Of course she did. And Zeus, hearing her coming, panicked and did something quick and desperate. He turned Io into a cow. A white cow, a lovely one, but a cow. He stood there in the clearing next to this nervous heifer trying to look casual, like a man who has absolutely not just transformed his companion into livestock to avoid an awkward conversation. Hera arrived. She looked at the cloud now thinning. She looked at her husband. She looked at the suspiciously beautiful cow standing very still beside him, and she said, more or less, "What a lovely cow, darling. Give it to me." What was he going to say? No. On what grounds? He had no innocent reason to refuse a gift to his wife, because any reason he gave would admit the cow was something other than a cow. So he handed Io over. He gave the woman he'd just ruined, in cow form, to the one person in the universe most motivated to make her miserable, and he did it smiling. Hera was not fooled for a second. She took the cow and she set a guardian over it, and this guardian is one of my favourite grim little details in all of this, so we'll get to him properly in a moment, because he deserves his own quiet introduction. His name was Argus, and he had 100 eyes. Argus Panoptes, Argus the All-Seeing, a giant with 100 eyes set all over his body, and the useful thing about a creature with 100 eyes is that he never fully sleeps. He closes some and keeps others open. He rests in shifts, the way you might if you owned 100 eyes and a deep sense of responsibility. Hera tied the cow Io to an olive tree and posted Argus to watch her, and now there was no cloud thick enough, no moment of distraction long enough for Zeus to undo what he'd done. The woman was a cow, tied to a tree, watched around the clock by a man who was essentially a security camera with legs. Io grazed. There was nothing else to do. She tried to speak to her own father when he wandered near, and what came out was lowing, just the sound a cow makes, and he didn't understand until she scratched her name into the dirt with her hoof. Imagine being him. You sent your daughter away to keep her safe, and now she's writing to you in the mud with her foot. The Greeks did not flinch from this stuff. They put it right in the children's stories. Zeus, to his minor credit, felt bad enough to do something. He sent his son, Hermes, the messenger, the trickster, the patron of anyone who's ever talked their way out of a locked room. Hermes came down disguised as a herdsman and sat with Argus, and he did the one thing that works on a creature who cannot ever fully sleep. He bored him. He talked. He played dull music on a reed pipe. He told the longest, flattest, most meandering stories he could invent, the kind with no ending, the kind that circle back on themselves, the kind I am frankly attempting on you right now for kinder reasons. And one by one, the 100 eyes began to close. When the last of them shut, Hermes did what he'd been sent to do, and Argus's long watch ended, and the giant was no longer living. Hera grieved him. He'd been loyal, and loyalty was rare in her world. So she took his 100 eyes, and she set them into the tail of her favourite bird, the peacock, where they remain to this day, 100 little watching eyes spread across the feathers, beautiful and slightly unsettling, the way the best memorials are. Next time you see a peacock fan that tail out, that's Argus. He's still watching. He just got promoted to decoration. Io was freed, technically, but Hera wasn't finished. She sent a single small fly to torment her, to sting and never stop, and the cow that had been a woman ran. She ran across the whole known world to get away from one insect, swam a strait so famous for her crossing it that they named it after her, the Bosphorus, the Oxford, the place where the cow went over. She ran all the way to Egypt before Zeus quietly restored her to herself, and the whole long ordeal finally wound down. She got a life back, a throne, even, eventually. But she spent the prime of it as livestock running from a fly, and the fly was the easy part. That's Io. Hold on to the cloud, the cow, and the peacock. All three come back. Now let's go somewhere drier and meet a princess who got a much shinier deal and a much stranger ride. Europa was the daughter of a king, gathering flowers by the seashore with her companions on a bright ordinary morning, the kind of morning where nothing is supposed to happen. There was a herd of cattle on the beach, among them one bull, and this bull was magnificent, white as fresh snow, gentle as a pet, with horns like polished crescents, and a smell about him, the old poets insisted, of flowers and spice rather than barn. He was, you will not be stunned to learn, not a bull. Europa was charmed. The bull knelt in the sand, friendly, inviting, and she draped flowers on his horns and eventually, laughing, climbed onto his broad white back. Which is the exact moment a normal bull becomes a problem and a disguised god becomes a getaway vehicle. He stood. He walked to the water's edge, and then he went straight into the sea and started swimming, with the king's daughter clinging to his back and the shore getting smaller behind her. She sailed the whole way to Crete on the back of a bull, across open water, too far out to do anything but hold on. Sea creatures supposedly rose up to escort the procession, dolphins and lesser sea gods turning the abduction into a parade, which is a very Greek way to dress up a kidnapping as an honour. On Crete, Zeus returned to his own shape, and Europa became a queen, and her sons became kings, and one of them, Minos, became a name you might know from a certain maze with a certain creature in it. We'll let that thread dangle for now. But notice the geography. A princess from the eastern shore carried west across the water, and a whole continent took her name, Europe. You are, if you live on it, named after a girl who climbed onto the wrong bull. The map is full of these. Half the place names in the Greek world are someone Zeus liked, frozen into geography forever, which is one way to be remembered, and not the way most of them would have chosen. The bull got remembered too, set among the stars as the constellation Taurus, though only the front half of him, forever swimming, the back end submerged below the horizon line. Even the cattle in this story get a better afterlife than most of the women. Keep the bull in mind. We have not seen the last of Zeus arriving with hooves and a plan. Now you've met two who survived more or less intact. Let's meet one who did everything right, asked for one reasonable thing, and got the worst outcome in the entire catalogue, because the universe these people lived in did not reward good sense. Her name was Semele, a princess of Thebes, and Zeus loved her, and for once he came to her not as an animal but simply as a hidden visitor, a presence in the dark she couldn't quite see. And Hera naturally found out. Hera always found out. But this time she didn't send a fly or a giant. She did something quieter and far more clever. She planted a doubt. Disguised as an old nurse and age-trusted woman, Hera came to Semele and got her talking, the way an old confidant does, and she let slip a worry. "Are you sure, dear, that this visitor of yours is really a god? Anyone can claim to be a god in the dark. How would you actually know? You should ask him to prove it. Ask him to come to you the way he comes to his own wife, in his full glory, and then you'll be certain." It was a perfect trap because it sounded like care. Semele, now uncertain, went to Zeus and asked him for a promise before she made her request, and he, besotted, swore by the river Styx to give her whatever she asked. That oath was the most binding oath a god could make, unbreakable. And then she asked, "Show me your true form. Come to me as you come to Hera." He begged her to choose something else. He knew exactly what would happen. A mortal cannot stand in the presence of a god's full, undisguised power any more than you can hold a lightning storm in your two hands. But he'd sworn by the Styx, and even the king of the gods could not take that back. So he came to her as he truly was, all the storm and fire of him at once, and Semele could not survive the sight of it. Her life ended in that brightness, undone by the one wish she'd been tricked into making. But she was carrying a child, and Zeus, moving fast, saved the unborn baby and sewed it into his own thigh to finish growing, which is exactly as strange as it sounds, and which we will absolutely return to, because that child grew up to be the god of wine, and he never stopped trying to bring his lost mother back. The thigh. We have to talk about the thigh, because it's one of those details that sounds like a mistranslation and isn't. When Semele's life ended, the child inside her was only 6 months along. Zeus snatched the infant up and made an incubator of his own leg, stitching the baby into his thigh to carry the remaining 3 months himself. And when the time came, the child was born a second time out of his father, which earned him a name that means twice born, Dionysus, the god of the vine, of wine, of the loosening of everything tightly held, born once from a woman the world undid, and once from the thigh of the man who'd loved her. No wonder he turned out the way he did. He grew up hunted. Hera's grudge didn't end with the mother, it followed the son, and so the infant Dionysus was hidden, passed around, disguised, raised in secret in faraway places by nymphs on a mountain nobody could quite locate, dressed at one point as a little girl to throw the searchers off, a childhood spent in hiding from your own stepmother, who happens to be the Queen of Heaven. Therapy had not been invented. He invented wine instead, which the Greeks considered a reasonable substitute, and which, in fairness, is more widely available. And here's the part that lands quietly. Once Dionysus was grown and a god in his own right, with his own followers and his own power, he went down into the underworld to find his mother, down to the realm of the ones who are no longer living, to fetch a woman whose life had ended before he was born, and he brought her back up and set her among the immortals, gave her a place on Olympus, renamed and restored. Of all the children in this whole sprawling story, he's the only one who went back for a parent. Most of them were too busy surviving. Hold on to Dionysus. He's the warmest thread in a cold tapestry, and he comes back at the very end. Now let's go from the woman who got the worst of it to the one who arguably started the worst of it, though she never asked to. You've woken up in Sparta this time, in the household of a king, and there is a swan in trouble on the water. A large white swan beating its wings, being pursued across the surface by an eagle, and the queen of this household, a woman named Leda, watches the chase and feels for the swan. It flees to her for protection, this elegant, terrified bird, and she shelters it in her arms. You already know. The swan was no more a swan than the cuckoo was a cuckoo, or the bull was a bull. The eagle was staged. The whole little drama was theatre, arranged so that Leda would do exactly what kindness told her to do, which was take the frightened, beautiful thing into her arms. This is the third time now we've watched the same machine run. A woman is kind to a helpless animal, and the animal is the trap. Cuckoo, cow's tail aside, swan. He found a woman's decency and used it as a door. I want you to notice that the disguise isn't really about the animal. It's about the kindness. He kept choosing shapes that would make a good person let down her guard. That's the actual pattern, and it's bleaker than the costumes make it sound. What came of that night in Sparta is genuinely strange. Even for this, Leda produced eggs, 2 of them, by most tellings, because that same night she was also with her mortal husband the king, and so the children came mixed, some divine and some human, hatched together. From those eggs came 2 sets of twins. The brothers, Castor and Pollux, one mortal and one immortal, so devoted that when the mortal one's life ended, the immortal one asked to share his own deathlessness rather than live on alone, and the 2 of them were set in the sky together as the constellation Gemini, taking turns, one always above and one always below. That's a love story tucked inside a grimmer one, and it's allowed to just sit there being lovely. And from the other egg came a daughter, Helen. Helen of Sparta, who would become Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, whose face, as the line goes, launched 1,000 ships, a whole 10-year war, an entire ruined city, the long sad catalogue of the Iliad, all of it traceable back to one staged swan on a Spartan pond. Zeus didn't fight in that war, he mostly watched, but he hatched it, in the most literal possible sense. The egg sat in his lap the whole time. Hold on to Helen, she's the longest fuse in the story. We lit her here, she goes off much later. Let's stay with consequences for a moment, because the next one is about a child who paid for the circumstances of his own birth, and a mother who was tricked by the exact same nurse and doubt trick Hera used on Semele, just dressed differently. Her name was Danaë, and her father the king had been warned by an oracle of the worst possible news a Greek father could receive, that his daughter's son would one day end his life. Note the cruelty of the setup. Not that Danaë would harm him, but that a grandson she hadn't even had yet was fated to. So the king did the logical, monstrous thing. He locked his daughter away, shut her in a chamber of bronze or a tower, depending on who's telling it, underground or up high but always sealed, so that no man could ever reach her and no grandson could ever be born. He imprisoned his own child to outrun a prophecy. This never works. Outrunning prophecies is the one activity Greeks were worst at and most committed to. It didn't work this time either, because you cannot wall out the sky. Zeus came to Danaë in a sealed bronze room as a shower of golden rain, a fall of light pouring down through whatever small gap the architecture left, and there was simply no defending against that. How do you lock out the weather? And so, in the one place in the world built specifically to prevent it, Danaë conceived a son. His name was Perseus, and yes, he's that Perseus, the one with the winged sandals and the reflective shield and the head of a certain snake-haired creature you must never look at directly. He's a whole heroic saga of his own. But he begins here, as the impossible baby in the locked room, the prophecy the bronze walls couldn't stop. When the king found out, he didn't dare harm a child of Zeus directly, so he chose deniability. He put his daughter and her infant into a wooden chest and set them adrift on the open sea, sealed them up and pushed them out onto the water to let distance and chance do what he wouldn't do with his own hands. A mother and a baby in a box on the waves. The Greeks really did hand these stories to children at bedtime, and the children presumably slept, the way you're going to. The chest didn't go under, of course it didn't. They drifted to a far island and were hauled ashore in a fisherman's net, and Danaë and Perseus stepped out of the box alive into the next chapter of a prophecy that, decades later, would complete itself in a way the old king never escaped, because they never do. We'll leave him there, still on his throne, still certain he's clever, with the sea breeze coming in. We've spent a while now with women who were pursued. Let's change the shape of the story entirely, because Zeus didn't only come down for women, and the one time the lover was a young man, it rearranged the staffing of heaven. His name was Ganymede, and he was a prince of Troy, a boy tending his father's flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida, said to be the most beautiful mortal alive. Not a woman in a meadow this time, a shepherd boy on a hillside. And Zeus, looking down, decided he wanted this one near him always, up on Olympus, not visited and abandoned like the others, but kept. So he came as the eagle, the same eagle possibly that had pretended to chase the swan, now playing itself instead of a prop. A great bird stooped out of the sky and lifted Ganymede off the mountain and carried him up, and the boy was gone from the world, taken into the household of the gods. His father grieved, the way you would if your son were simply lifted into the clouds one afternoon and not returned. And Zeus, who occasionally understood that he owed people things, sent compensation, a gift of magnificent immortal horses, the finest ever seen, in exchange for the boy. A father's son traded for a pair of horses. It was meant kindly, in the strange arithmetic of the gods, and it didn't help at all. Up on Olympus, Ganymede was made cupbearer. He poured the nectar at the feasts, the role that had belonged to Hebe, the goddess of youth, who was Hera's own daughter. So now a Trojan boy, brought up by the husband, held the position the wife's child used to hold, refilling the cups at every banquet, present at every meal, a permanent reminder pouring the wine. You can imagine how that went over with Hera. Add it to the list. She kept a long one, and here is the part that lingers. Ganymede was made immortal. Unlike almost everyone else in this story, his story doesn't end in loss, or transformation or wandering. He simply stays young forever up there, doing his small eternal job. He was set among the stars too, as Aquarius, the water-bearer, the one pouring out an endless stream. Of all of Zeus's loves, he may have gotten the gentlest ending, which is a strange sentence to write about a child carried off by an eagle. But the bar, as you've noticed, is on the floor. Hold on to the eagle. It's the one shape Zeus seems to have actually liked being. Now let's meet the goddesses, because so far we've mostly watched mortals get caught in the gears, and the gears themselves have a history. Before Hera, before the marriage that anchors all of this, Zeus had other wives, other partners, divine ones, and the very first of them is one of the saddest and least remembered. Her name was Metis, and her name means cunning, or wise counsel, the deep practical intelligence that solves problems. She was Zeus's first love and his first wife, and she was, by every account, cleverer than he was. She'd helped him in the great war that put him on the throne, given him the means to free his swallowed siblings, been the brains behind the rise. And then a prophecy arrived. because of course it did. Metis would bear children, a daughter first, and then a son who would one day overthrow his father and take the throne, exactly as Zeus had overthrown his own father, exactly as that father had overthrown his. The family pattern was sons unseating fathers, over and over, going back to the beginning of things. Zeus knew the pattern intimately because he was its latest winner, and he did not intend to be its next loser. So when Metis was carrying their first child, he solved the problem the way his ancestors had solved theirs, with one grim improvement. His father had swallowed his children after they were born. Zeus swallowed the mother whole while the child was still inside her, and the wisest being in the cosmos went down and was simply gone, absorbed, ended as a separate person. But she wasn't entirely gone. This is where it turns strange. Sometime later, Zeus developed a headache. Not an ordinary one. A splitting, mounting, unbearable pressure in his skull that grew until he could not stand it, and at last another god took a blade and opened his head to release it, and out of the wound, fully grown, fully armoured, with a shout leapt a goddess, Athena, wisdom, strategy, the grey-eyed one, born from her father's head because her mother had been swallowed before she could be born the ordinary way. She carried Metis's cleverness forward into the world. The mother became the daughter's mind, and Metis herself stayed down inside Zeus, they said, advising him from within, the swallowed counsel he could never quite be rid of and never again had to credit. So the wisest of his loves became a voice in his own head, and a goddess sprung from his skull, and her name, Metis, faded so far that most people who know Athena have never heard it. That's the cost of the throne, paid by someone else. Sit with her a moment in the dark. She was first and she was best, and almost no one remembers her name. Let's stay among the goddesses because the second wife is the one who quietly organised time itself. Her name was Themis, and she was one of the old powers, a titaness, the embodiment of divine law, of right order, of the way things are properly done. After Metis, Zeus took Themis, and this was a different kind of union, less a conquest than a structuring. With her, he didn't produce monsters or heroes or scandals, he produced order. Their daughters were the Horol, the seasons, the ones who turn the year and keep the natural rhythm of growth and rest. Spring, summer, the turning of it, the reason the year has a shape at all, and their other daughters were the Moirai, the Fates, the three who spin the thread of every life, measure it out, and decide where it ends. Think about that arrangement for a moment. The king of the gods, with all his lightning and all his appetite, fathered the three beings who hold the measuring and the ending of every life in the cosmos, including, in the oldest understanding, his own. There were limits even on him, and he'd fathered them himself, with the goddess of how things ought to be. Even Zeus could not simply overrule the fates. He could rage at the thread. He couldn't cut it early or splice it longer. The thunder stopped at the spinning wheel. This is the quietest of his unions and maybe the most important, because it's the one that put guardrails on the universe. With Metis, he gained a mind by swallowing it. With Themis, he gained structure by honouring it. The contrast tells you something about which loves built the world and which ones just rattled it. Hold on to the fates. Their thread runs under every single section still to come, including the ones that end badly, which is most of them. After Themis came Mnemosyne, and her name is one you half know without knowing it, because it's the root of the word memory. Mnemosyne was memory itself, another of the old Titan powers, and the story of her union with Zeus is unusually specific about its duration. 9 nights. He came to her for 9 nights in a row, and from those 9 nights came 9 daughters, born together, the Muses. You know the Muses even if you've never counted them. They're the ones poets call on at the start of every epic, the divine sources of music and dance and history and astronomy, and the different kinds of poetry, the inspiration behind every song and story the Greeks valued. And here's the lovely logic buried in the parentage. Their mother is memory, their father is the king of the gods. So art in this telling is the child of power and remembrance, the thing that happens when raw force is wedded to the act of not forgetting. Every poem is a small rebellion against things vanishing. The Greeks built that idea right into the family tree. There's a tenderness in this one that's missing from most of the others. No disguise, no trick, no fleeing kindness turned into a trap. Just 9 quiet nights with memory, and the result was everything that lets us still hear any of these stories at all. Without the Muses, none of this survives. The whole reason you're lying in the dark, hearing about a cuckoo and a swan and a shower of gold, is that 9 sisters, born of memory, kept it from slipping away. Hold on to the Muses. In a sense, they're narrating this whole thing. We're inside their job description. Now down from the heights again, because we've been among the goddesses for a while, and the mortals are where the real cost always lands. Let's find a nymph, because the nymphs got a particularly raw deal, and one of them turned a punishment into the saddest sound in the woods. Her name was Echo, and she was a mountain nymph with a gift for talk, a chatterer, quick and delightful and never short of something to say. And she got pulled into the oldest job in this story, which is covering for Zeus. When he came down to dally among the nymphs in the hills, Echo was the one who'd keep Hera busy, talking and talking, a charming endless stream of conversation that held the queen's attention while, elsewhere on the mountain, the others slipped away. She was the distraction. She was good at it, right up until Hera worked out what the talking was for. Hera's punishment was perfect in its cruelty, because it took the exact gift Echo had misused and turned it inside out. From now on, Hera decreed, you will not speak first. You will never again start a conversation, never say your own words, never tell anyone what you feel. You will only be able to repeat the last words spoken to you by someone else. The chatterer was sentenced to silence wearing the shape of speech, and then, because the universe was not finished with her, Echo fell in love with a beautiful young man named Narcissus, who you may have heard of, who was so taken with his own reflection in a pool that he couldn't love anyone else. Echo followed him through the woods, aching to speak to him, to tell him how she felt, and she couldn't. All she could do was wait for him to say something and throw the end of it back. He'd call out who's there, and she could only answer there. He turned away. She faded and faded until there was nothing left of her but the voice, the helpless repeating voice you still hear bouncing off canyon walls and empty rooms. That's her. When you shout into a valley and the valley answers with your own last word, that's a nymph who once talked too much to cover for a god, repeating you because she's not allowed to say anything of her own. The next time it happens to you, be a little gentle about it. That's the texture of being a nymph in Zeus's orbit. You weren't even the lover sometimes. You were just the help, and you paid anyway. Let's meet one who was the lover, and who got turned not into a voice, but into a fixture of the night sky, hunted there forever by a jealous arrangement. Her name was Callisto, and she was a follower of Artemis, the huntress, the goddess of wild places, whose companions all swore to stay unmarried and free, running with her through the forests. Callisto took that vow. She meant it. And Zeus wanted her anyway, and knowing she'd never break her oath willingly, he did something especially underhanded, even for him. He came to her disguised as Artemis, as the very goddess she'd devoted herself to. He wore the face of her beloved leader to get close, and by the time the disguise dropped, it was too late. When it came out, as these things always did, Callisto lost everything at once. Artemis cast her out of the company for breaking her vow, even though the breaking wasn't her doing. And Hera, furious as ever at a husband she couldn't punish, turned her fury where she always turned it, onto the woman and changed Callisto into a bear. A great shaggy bear, wandering the forests she used to run through as a girl, afraid now of the hunters she used to hunt beside, carrying a human mind inside an animal's body. We've seen this exact shape before, with Io and the cow. Hera had a signature move, and it was making women into the animals their hunters would aim at. Years passed. Callisto the bear had a son, born before her transformation, a boy named Arcas who grew up not knowing his mother was the bear in the woods. And one day, inevitably, they met. The young man out hunting the bear that was his mother, lumbering toward him in what she meant as recognition, and he could only read as attack. He raised his spear. A son about to harm his own mother, neither of them knowing, the whole horrible accident a heartbeat from completing itself. And Zeus, watching, finally intervened, snatched them both up into the sky before the spear could fall, and set them among the stars as the Great Bear and the Little Bear, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. Their mother and her son turned to constellations so they could be together without harm. It sounds like a rescue. It almost is. But Hera got the last word even there. She went to the old sea gods and asked one final spite, that these two new constellations never be allowed to sink down and rest below the ocean's edge the way other stars do, and so the Great Bear and the Little Bear wheel around the pole and never set, never dip below the horizon for their rest, circling the north all night, every night for all of time. Look up on a clear night and find them. They're still turning up there, the woman and her boy never allowed to lie down. Hold on to the bears and the stars and Hera's very long memory. We're nearly to the part of the night where the sky is all that's left of these people. Let's go back down to the mortal world, because we left some of the biggest stories on the table, and the next one is the reason a hero exists whose name you already know before I say it. Her name was Alcmene, and she was already married. Happily even to a man named Amphitryon, a good soldier away at war. And this is where Zeus did something he hadn't quite done before. Something that makes the Callisto trick look almost honest by comparison. He didn't come as a swan or a bull or a fall of gold. He came as her husband. He took Amphitryon's exact face and voice and bearing, walked into the house as the man she loved, home early from the fighting, and Alcmene welcomed him the way any wife welcomes a husband back from a war she's been dreading. She had no way to know. There was no seam in the disguise, no animal to be suspicious of, nothing to warn her. It was the cruelest possible version of the deception, because it wore the face of the one person she'd have opened the door to without a second thought. And Zeus wanted this night to count, so he made it longer. By the old telling, he ordered the sun not to rise, stretched a single night out to the length of 3, so that the hours he spent as the false husband ran on, while the world stayed dark and the dawn simply didn't come. 3 nights folded into one, the sky held shut over the whole sleeping countryside. Somewhere a rooster must have been deeply confused. Then the real Amphitryon came home, the actual one that very next day, back from the actual war, expecting the welcome a returning husband gets, and finding his wife a little puzzled, because as far as she knew he'd already arrived the night before, and they'd already had their reunion. You can imagine the conversation. It went about as well as that conversation can go. It took a prophet to sort out what had happened, to explain that the king of the gods had been wearing his face, and to convince a justifiably bewildered man that his wife had done nothing wrong, that the deception had been total, and the fault entirely the sky's. What came of that long-stolen night was Heracles. Hercules, if you grew up with the Roman spelling, the strongest hero the Greek world ever imagined, the one with the lion skin and the 12 impossible labours and the temper and the enormous sorrow that ran underneath all of it. He had a mortal twin too, a half-brother conceived the same crowded night by the real husband, an ordinary boy named Iphicles growing up beside a child who could strangle serpents in his cradle. Which Heracles did in fact because Hera, learning that another of her husband's sons had arrived in the world, sent 2 snakes into the nursery to end him before he could grow. The infant simply caught them, one in each fist, and that was that. His mortal twin screamed the house awake. Heracles played with the snakes. Here is the part that turns the whole thing bitter, though. The name. Heracles means, more or less, the glory of Hera. The greatest hero of the Greeks was named in honour of the goddess who spent his entire life trying to undo him, possibly as an attempt to appease her, to flatter the storm into calming. It did not work. Nothing worked. She hounded him from the cradle to the end, drove him at one point into a madness that cost him everything he loved, and the famous labours themselves were penance for harm done while he wasn't himself, harm she had engineered. The strongest man in the world spent his life carrying a punishment for something that was never his doing, named all the while after the one who arranged it. Hold on to Heracles. He's the clearest case in the whole catalogue of a child paying his father's bill, with interest, forever. Let's stay a moment with how often that happens, the children of these unions inheriting a debt they never ran up, because the great bloodlines almost all start exactly here. Zeus loved a woman, and from that came a son, and from that son a grandson, and so on down a chain of generations that run straight into the most famous cursed families in all of Greek storytelling, the houses that the great tragedies are about, the ones where every generation does something unspeakable to the next and the gods keep score across centuries. That's the thing nobody mentions about the grand bloodlines. They almost all start in a meadow or a tower or a borrowed bed, with Zeus noticing someone. The heroic genealogies the Greeks were so proud of, the royal houses that trace themselves back to a god to justify their crowns, are very often tracing themselves back to exactly this, a moment when an ordinary woman's life was taken over by the weather. The glory and the curse came from the same source. You couldn't claim one without inheriting the other. That's worth sitting with as the room gets darker. The Greeks didn't separate these things the way we'd like to. The divine ancestor who made your family important was the same divine ancestor whose carelessness seeded the disaster that would eventually undo you. Descent from Zeus was a blessing and a debt in the same breath, and the great tragic houses spent generations paying down a loan their founding mother never asked to take out. We'll let those bloodlines run on into the dark where they belong and turn to someone who got a kinder myth, or at least a stranger one. Let's talk about Aegina, because her story has a detail in it that's pure and grim and quietly beautiful all at once. Aegina was the daughter of a river god, carried off by Zeus to an island that afterward took her name, the usual shape. A father raging along his own banks, a daughter gone, a new place on the map named for a woman who didn't choose to lend it her name. But what happened on that island later is the part worth staying awake for. Her son, Aeacus, grew up to rule the island, and Hera, still working her way down the long list of her husband's loves and their offspring, sent a sickness over the place. A plague that moved through the people until the island was nearly emptied of them. the living grown so few they could no longer tend the ones who were gone. Aeacus, alone among a vanishing people, his kingdom thinning to almost nothing around him, prayed to his father for help, and he prayed beside an oak tree, an oak sacred to Zeus. And as he prayed, he watched a long column of ants moving up and down the trunk, an endless, industrious line of them, thousands, working together, carrying their tiny loads, and he asked, half broken, for as many citizens as there were ants on that tree. He went to sleep grieving. He woke to a kingdom full of people. Zeus had turned the ants into men, a whole new population risen overnight from the insects on the sacred oak, and they were called the Myrmidons, from the Greek word for ant. And they became the most disciplined, tireless, loyal soldiers in the Greek world, the very warriors who later followed Achilles to Troy, an army born from an ant colony, given to a man who'd watched his real people fade away. It's the closest thing in the catalogue to a fair trade, and it's still built on a foundation of loss. Even the rescues here are stitched out of grief. Hold on to the ants, hold on to the oak. Of all the strange afterlives in this story, a kingdom of former insects marching off to the most famous war in history is one I'd want you carrying into sleep, because it's the rare one where the answer to a prayer was simply more life, handed over by the same sky that usually only took. We've been with the famous ones. Let's go quieter now, into the company of women whose names the great poems barely paused on, because the dark is the right place for the half-forgotten, and there are more of them than the catalogue likes to admit. There was Taygete, one of the Pleiades, a sister of shy Maia, and her story has a rescue folded into it that doesn't quite work. Pursued by Zeus, she went to Artemis for help, and Artemis, goddess of the unmarried and the wild, did her a favour and turned her into a doe, a deer, to hide her, to let her slip the chase wearing another body. It didn't hold. It never holds. But the doe she'd briefly been left a mark on the world, because that disguise became, in some tellings, the famous golden-horned deer that Heracles spent a year chasing across the north for one of his labours, the one creature he was forbidden to harm and had to take alive. So a woman's hiding place became a hero's impossible quarry. Generations later, the deer still running because the woman inside it had needed once to not be caught. Her son Lacedaemon gave his name to the land around Sparta. She lent her own name to a mountain. And the mountain is still there, a long pale ridge above the valley, called Taygete to this day, named for a Pleiad who spent part of her story as a deer trying not to be seen. You can look it up. The map remembers her better than the stories do. There was Electra, another of the 7 sisters, and her grief is the kind the Greeks built right into the night sky. By one tradition, she was the mother of Dardanus, the founder of the line that led to Troy, and when Troy finally went down in flames at the end of that long war, Electra could not bear to watch the city her descendants had built come to its end. So she left her place among her sisters in the Pleiades. She hid her face, and that, the old storyteller said, is why the cluster is so hard to count, why you reach for the 7th sister and can never quite find her, why the Pleiades shimmer at the edge of sight with one star always seeming to be missing. It's a grieving grandmother who turned away from the sky so she wouldn't have to see what became of her family. The next clear night, try to count them and come up short, and know that the missing one is a woman who couldn't look. That's the kind of thing the Greeks did with a smudge of faint stars. They made it a heartbreak you can verify with your own eyes. There was Pluto, a name that throws people, because we associate it with the lord of the underworld, but this Pluto was a nymph, a daughter of the old earth powers, and her name simply meant wealth, abundance, the riches that come up out of the ground. Zeus loved her, and their son was Tantalus, And now we're back at the edge of one of those cursed houses, because Tantalus is the founder of the worst of them. He's the one whose name gave us the word tantalize, condemned in the underworld to stand in water that drains away whenever he bends to drink, and beneath fruit that lifts out of reach whenever he stretches up for it, forever almost satisfied and never quite. He earned his punishment with a crime so awful the Greeks used it as the benchmark for impiety. But notice his mother, a nymph named for abundance, for plenty, for everything, coming up rich out of the earth, and her son became the eternal image of never having enough. The richest name in the family produced the hungriest fate in it. The Greeks rarely missed a chance for that kind of dark symmetry, and they didn't miss it here. And there were the ones with almost nothing left at all. A nymph named Himalia, on the island of Rhodes, who bore 3 sons, and whose name survives mostly as a footnote and, oddly, as one of the small moons now circling the planet Jupiter. Because when astronomers needed names for the dozens of little worlds orbiting the king of the planets, they reached, with a kind of grim wit, into exactly this catalogue. The planet named for Zeus is ringed by moons named for his loves. Himalia is up there, a speck of rock 30 kilometres across, and so are Io and Europa, and Ganymede and Callisto, and Leda and Thebe, and dozens more. The whole guest list of this story relocated to the cold dark around a gas giant. The pattern that started with constellations finished, 3,000 years later, with telescopes. We're still naming the things we discover after the people Zeus noticed. The catalogue never actually closes. It just keeps finding new skies to write itself across. That's the texture down here at the bottom of the list, where the stories thin out to a name and a son and a place that took the name. Let's stay with one more of the quieter ones, though, because she did something none of the others managed, something that cuts against the whole helpless pattern of this catalogue. Her name was Nemesis, and she was a goddess, the embodiment of the thing her name still means, the force that brings down whatever has risen too high, the corrective that comes for the proud and the lucky and the ones who've had too much go their way. Retribution, balance, the bill arriving, and Zeus pursued her, the way he pursued everyone, and Nemesis did not simply submit to it. She ran, and as she ran, she changed shape to escape him, became a fish and dove into the sea, became every kind of beast in turn, a whole desperate sequence of bodies, fleeing across the world and through the elements, refusing at every step to be caught. For once the shape-changing belonged to the one being chased. She used his own favourite trick against him, and she used it to say no over and over, in a dozen different forms. She lost in the end. That's the hard truth of it, and I won't dress it up. He matched her transformations, became a creature that could catch each creature she became, and in the final shape of the chase he took the form of a swan, and there's that swan again, the same bird from Leda's story, and the two traditions tangle here in a way the Greeks themselves couldn't fully sort out. By one strand of the myth, the famous egg that produced Helen was actually Nemesis's, laid after this chase and only fostered by Leda, so that the whole Trojan War traces back not to a Spartan queen's kindness, but to retribution herself, fleeing and caught, which would mean the most beautiful woman in the world was the daughter of the goddess of consequences. Sit with that for a second. It would make Helen not a prize but a reckoning, a war that was always going to come due, Balance arriving wearing the most beautiful face anyone had ever seen. The Greeks left both versions standing. They liked the idea that the face that launched 1,000 ships might have been retribution all along. Hold on to Nemesis, the one who fought the whole way and changed shape after shape to refuse it, and lost, and may have laid the egg that burned a city down anyway. If there's a patron saint of everyone in this catalogue who said no and meant it, it's her. We're moving into the last stretch now, and the women left to meet are the ones whose stories the Greeks told to explain why the world has the shape it has. Let's talk about the loves that explain things, the ones the Greeks reached for when they needed a reason the world works the way it does, because some of Zeus's unions weren't scandals at all. They were the scaffolding of how the cosmos got organized, and the first of them gave the world its harvest. Her name was Demeter, and she was his sister, one of the great goddesses, the power of the grain and the growing earth, of everything that ripens in a field and feeds a people through a winter. Zeus and Demeter together had a daughter, and her name was Persephone, and if you know one story about the underworld, you probably know hers. Persephone was gathering flowers, the way these stories so often begin, when the ground opened and the Lord of the Dead came up in a dark chariot and carried her down below, and the crucial, quietly devastating detail is who allowed it. Persephone's abductor had asked Zeus, her own father, for her, and Zeus had said yes, or near enough to yes, without telling her mother, without telling the girl. He gave his daughter away to the realm of the departed and let it happen as an ambush. Demeter searched the whole world for her child, and in her grief she let everything that grows simply stop. The fields going bare, the harvest failing, the first winter spreading across a world that had never known one, until the threat of an entire mortal race fading from hunger forced a bargain. The bargain is the part everyone remembers. Persephone had eaten a few seeds of a pomegranate in the underworld, and anyone who eats the food of the dead is bound to it, so she could not simply come home. The compromise was a division of the year. Part of it she spends below, and during those months her mother grieves, and the earth goes cold and bare and nothing grows. Part of it she returns to the light, and her mother rejoices, and the world greens and ripens again. That's the seasons. That's why the year has a winter. A father's quiet betrayal of his daughter, a mother's world-stopping grief, and a compromise measured out in pomegranate seeds, and the whole turning calendar of cold and warmth that you live inside every year of your life comes out of it. Every winter you've ever been cold in is Demeter missing her daughter. The Greeks felt the season change and knew exactly whose sorrow they were standing in. Hold on to Persephone. Of all the children in this catalogue, she's the one whose story you live through personally 4 times a year. Whether you think about her or not, the cold coming on is hers. Let's stay among the great organising goddesses, because before the famous marriages there were unions that built the very structure of the divine world, and one of them gave us a set of goddesses you've absolutely heard invoked without knowing whose daughters they were. We touched on Themis earlier, and the fates and the seasons that came of her, but there's a softer set of daughters from a union we should sit with, because the Greeks credited Zeus with fathering the Graces. The Charites, 3 goddesses of beauty, of charm, of the grace that makes a feast warm and a gift gladly given, and a piece of music land in the chest the right way. Their mother, by the common telling, was an ocean nymph named Eurynome, a daughter of the old sea, and from that union came the 3 sisters who attend on beauty wherever it appears, who dance in the company of the muses, who make the difference between a thing that is merely correct and a thing that is lovely. If the muses are the source of art, the graces are the source of the charm that makes art worth having, the warmth in it, the thing that makes you glad rather than merely impressed. The Greeks separated those 2 qualities and gave them 2 sets of divine sisters, and made Zeus the father of both, so that the king of the storms is also, somewhere in his vast contradictory portfolio, the origin of grace itself. It's an odd thing to hold beside the cuckoo and the cow and the false husband. The same figure who took so many lives over fathered the very idea of charm. The Greeks were comfortable with their gods being everything at once. We're the ones who want them to be consistent. There were Eurynome's daughters, and there were stranger pairings still, because the older the layer of myth you dig into, the weirder and grander the unions get, away from the soap opera of mortal women and into the architecture of reality itself. Let's go down into the underworld for one of them, because Zeus's reach extended even there, into the realm of the departed in a story most people never hear. There's a tradition, an old and shadowy one, in which Zeus took a form to approach Persephone herself, his own daughter by Demeter, down in the dark kingdom where she'd become queen. It's one of the most uncomfortable corners of the whole mythology, and the Greeks who told it knew it was uncomfortable, which is part of why it belonged to the mystery cults, the secret religious societies that met at night and swore their members to silence about what they'd learned. From that union, by the secret tradition, came a child sometimes called Zagreus, a horned infant who was meant to inherit the whole cosmos, who the old Titans came for and undid, and who was reborn in the deepest layers of the story as a form of Dionysus himself. The same Dionysus from earlier, the twice-born, the one who went down for his mother. In these hidden tellings he'd been down there before in a previous life, undone and remade, which is why he of all the gods could walk into the realm of the departed and walk back out. He knew the way because he'd been through it once already. I'm flagging this one as genuinely shadowy, the kind of myth that was deliberately kept half-secret and survives in fragments, contradictions, and the writings of people trying to reconstruct rituals they'd been forbidden to describe. The Greeks didn't all agree it happened. The ones who believed it didn't all tell it the same way. But it's there, in the deep strata, the suggestion that the warmest figure in our whole catalogue, the son who fetched his mother back from below, could make that journey because some older and darker version of himself had already been broken and reassembled in the dark. Hold on to that lightly, the way you'd hold a thing you're not sure is real. It's the underside of Dionysus, the part the daylight stories leave out, and it makes his one act of rescue feel less like a miracle and more like a man going back to a country he'd already survived. We've gone about as deep and as strange as this story goes. Let's come back up toward the surface, toward the loves that left their marks not in the underworld or the calendar, but simply in the long human business of cities and kings and the founding of places people actually lived. So much of the actual map of Greece, the real cities where real people lived and farmed and argued in the marketplace, traced itself back to one of these unions, and the people telling the stories were often standing in the very place the story was about. Think about what that meant on the ground. If you were born in a Greek city, there was a decent chance your city's founding legend ran back to Zeus and some local woman, a nymph of the nearby spring, a daughter of the river that watered your fields. Your home had a divine origin story, and that origin story was almost always this same shape, the sky taking an interest in a local girl, and a bloodline beginning. We've met Thebes, built by the singing twins from Antiope. We've met the line that ran to Troy through Electra and her son Dardanus. We've met the island of Aegina with its army of former ants. But it goes on and on, city after city, each one with its founding mother, each one proud of a descent that was, when you look at it plainly, the same act of weather over and over, dressed in local colours. There was a nymph named Thebe, who lent her name to that same great city, tangled up in its founding alongside the others, because Greek cities often claimed more than one origin and weren't troubled by the contradiction. There was Dia, mother of a king. There was a whole roster of river daughters and spring nymphs whose names survive only in the dry lists the ancient genealogists kept, the catalogues of who begat whom that scholars compiled to organize 1,000 local traditions into something like a family tree. Those lists are oddly moving to read, if you ever do. Page after page of women's names, each one attached to a sun and a place, each one a whole local cult and festival and civic pride reduced by the organizing impulse to a single line. The genealogists weren't trying to honor these women. They were trying to file them. But the filing is all that's left, and so the dry list became the memorial, which is not what anyone intended and is somehow the more honest for it. Here's the thing worth feeling about all these founder mothers as the night gets later. They were how a community explained itself to itself. When the people of a city gathered for their great festival and told the story of where they came from, they were telling this story, and they weren't telling it as a scandal. They told it as an honor, a distinction, proof that their particular patch of ground had been singled out by the highest power there was. The shame we might read into it now, they read as glory. A city descended from Zeus could hold its head up against any other. The woman at the root of it became less a person than a kind of civic foundation stone. Her name carved over the gate, invoked at the festivals, her supposed tomb shown to visitors. She got remembered, in a way. She just got remembered as a monument rather than a woman. Hold on to the founder mothers, the whole quiet army of them, because they're the reason this catalogue isn't only a list of disasters. To the people who told these stories, every name on it was also the beginning of a home. Let's narrow back down from the cities to a single strange woman, though, because one of these founding figures has a fate so peculiar and so sad that it became a byword in itself. Her name was Lamia, and she was a queen of Libya, beautiful, beloved by Zeus, and the mother of several of his children. The usual beginning. And then the usual antagonist arrived because Hera found out, and Hera's revenge on Lamia was among the most terrible in the whole catalogue. She saw to it that Lamia's children were taken from her, every one of them, all at once, and the grief of it broke something in the woman that never healed. She withdrew into a cave. She stopped being able to bear the sight of other people's children, the living ones, the ones still safe with their mothers, and her sorrow curdled over the long years into something monstrous, until the queen, who had lost everything, became a figure that Greek parents used to frighten their own children into behaving, a creature of the dark that came for the young. The Greeks had this habit of turning their most wronged women into their monsters, of taking a victim and generations later using her as a bogey. Lamia started as a grieving mother and ended as the thing you warned children about at night, and the distance between those two is the whole tragedy of her, compressed into a single name that came to mean monster. There's a detail in her story that I find almost unbearably human, so I'll give it to you and let it sit. By one telling, Hera cursed Lamia so that she could never close her eyes, never rest, never escape into sleep from the images of what she'd lost, condemned to lie awake forever with her grief. And Zeus, unable to undo a curse his wife had laid, did the one small thing he could. He gave Lamia the ability to remove her own eyes, to take them out and set them aside, so that she could at least have some respite from seeing, some darkness, some version of rest. It's a grotesque image, and also, if you turn it the right way, an act of mercy, the only comfort available in a situation with no good options, a way to give a sleepless woman a few hours of the dark she needed. I think about that more than I'd like to. The king of the gods, who could do almost anything, reduced to offering a grieving mother the ability to unsee the world for a little while. It's the smallest kindness in the entire catalogue, and it's offered to the woman who suffered nearly the most. Hold on to Lamia, gently. She started as someone loved, and ended as a warning, and the only tenderness she got was a way to close her eyes. So let's give the night some air, and go to one of the odder, lighter-footed corners of the catalogue, where the consequence wasn't grief or a monster, but simply a very strange family and a few unlikely gifts to the world. There's a tradition that Zeus, in the deep early days before the famous marriages settled into their patterns, fathered Aphrodite. Not the well-known birth, the one with the sea foam, but a quieter alternate tradition in which the goddess of love was simply his daughter, by an ocean nymph named Danaë, a shadowy figure whose name is really just the feminine form of his own. The Greeks couldn't agree on where Aphrodite came from, and that disagreement is itself revealing. Some said she rose from the sea, born of the foam in a way we'll keep tasteful and leave at the water's edge. Others said she was Zeus's daughter, plain and simple, and they worshipped her that way at certain old sanctuaries, with Danaë beside her as the mother nobody fully remembers. So the goddess of love herself might belong to this catalogue, might be one more child of Zeus and a half-forgotten nymph, which would make love itself his daughter. Set that beside everything we've covered, and let the irony land softly. The being responsible for so much sorrow in the name of desire may also have fathered the very goddess of desire. The Greeks didn't resolve it. They let both stories stand in different temples and never insisted you choose. And there were the genuinely peculiar children, the ones who don't fit any of the patterns. There was a tradition of a union producing the Corybantes, wild armoured spirits who danced and clashed their weapons together in a deafening rhythm, the ones whose noise once hid the cries of an infant from a devouring father in the founding story of the gods themselves. There were minor deities of rivers and winds and obscure local powers, each one slotted into the family tree by some priest or poet who needed Zeus at the root of their particular sacred thing. The pattern by now should be clear, and I won't belabor it. If a Greek wanted to explain where something came from, something powerful or beautiful or strange, the readiest answer was that Zeus had fathered it, and so the family tree grew until it included nearly everything, a sprawling, impossible genealogy with the storm god's name at the centre of it, like a spider at the middle of a very large web. Here's what I want you to take from the strange ones, the Corybantes and the obscure river spirits and the contested Aphrodite. The catalogue isn't really a list of romances at all. We call it the Lovers of Zeus because that's the hook, but what it actually is, when you stand far enough back, is the Greek explanation for abundance, for why the world is so full, why there are so many gods, so many heroes, so many sacred places, so many distinct powers running the rivers and the seasons and the arts and the cities. The answer they reached for over and over was generation fathering descent. The world is crowded with divine and half-divine things because the sky kept reaching down into it, and every reach left something behind. It's a fertility story dressed as a scandal sheet. Underneath all the disguises and the jealousy and the grief, the thing it's actually describing is a world too full of wonders to have come from any single tidy source. Hold on to that as we start to come down. The list is long because the world is full, and the Greeks couldn't think of any other way to explain a world that full, except to say that something enormous had loved a great many times. Let's go back to Thebes, because we mentioned the singing wall in passing, and then walked right by it, and it deserves to be stood in front of properly, because it's one of the few places in this whole catalogue where a child of Zeus built something instead of breaking it. Her name was Antiope, a princess of Thebes, beautiful enough that the trouble found her early. Zeus came to her by the usual route, and she conceived, and then her life did the thing these lives so reliably do, which is fall apart in the aftermath of a thing that wasn't her fault. Afraid of her father's anger, she fled her home, married a king in another city to escape, and was eventually dragged back and handed over to an uncle and his wife, a cruel woman named Dirce, who hated her, and saw to it that the years that followed were as hard as a person can make another person's years. Antiope bore her twin sons in the worst possible circumstances, out on a mountainside, and the infants were taken from her and left exposed on the slope to fend for themselves or fade, and she was shut up in captivity, mistreated for a span of years long enough that she must have stopped expecting it to end. The babies didn't fade. A herdsman found them and raised them, the way babies in these stories are always being found by herdsmen, and they grew into two very different men. Zethus was the strong one, the practical one, a herdsman and a fighter who worked with his hands and had no patience for anything that wasn't useful. Amphion was the dreamer, the musician, who'd been given a lyre by Hermes himself, and could play it in a way that did things ordinary music doesn't do. Two brothers, one who built with muscle and one who built with sound, and for a long while neither of them knew their mother was a prisoner suffering not far away. She got out eventually, escaped her captivity, found her way to her grown sons, and at first they didn't believe her. This ragged woman claiming to be the mother they'd never known. But the truth came out, the way it does, and when the brothers understood what had been done to her, and by whom, they came down on the city, and the woman who'd tormented her with the full weight of two angry sons who'd just learned what their mother had endured. The cruel dirts met an end the Greeks described with their usual frankness, and a spring near Thebes was said to carry her name afterward, which is the Greek way of leaving a permanent marker on a story that ended badly for someone. And then, with the city theirs, the brothers built its walls, and this is the part worth staying awake for. They divided the labour by temperament. Zethus, the strong one, hauled the great stones on his own back, heaving each one into place by main force, the honest brutal work of building a wall the way walls get built. And Amphion took out his lyre and played. He didn't lift a single stone. He sat and made music, and the stones of his half of the wall heard it, and rose up on their own, and floated into place, fitting themselves together in time with the song, until his entire stretch of the fortification stood finished, raised by nothing but sound. The two halves met in the middle, the strong brothers' wall and the musical brothers' wall, one built by labour and one built by beauty, joined into a single ring around the city, and Thebes had its famous 7 gates. I love that they built it together, the two methods side by side, because it refuses to pick a winner. The Greeks could have made the music the whole point, the magical brother showing up the labourer. They didn't. They had both walls go up, both brothers contribute, and the city stand on a foundation that was half sweat and half song. For once, a pair of Zeus's grandchildren used what they'd been given to make something that protected people and lasted for centuries, and they did it to honour a mother who'd been given nothing but suffering. Hold on to the singing wall. In a catalogue mostly made of things taken apart, somebody finally put stones together and did it with a tune. Let's stay with the mothers who got their rescue late, because there's a thread of them, the ones who suffered for years and then were reached by a child who came back, and the next is the gentlest goddess in the whole story, who had nowhere in the entire world to lie down. Her name was Leto, a titaness, mild and lovely, and Zeus loved her before the trouble of the famous marriage had fully hardened into its permanent shape. she conceived twins, and Hera, learning of it, did something that shows you the real reach of her fury, because she didn't go after Leto with a transformation or a monster. She went after the ground itself. Hera forbade every land in the world, every patch of solid earth, every island anchored to the seabed, from giving Leto a place to bring her children into the world. The whole earth was closed to her by decree, a pregnant goddess, near her time, wandering from country to country and being turned away at every shore, not because the people were cruel, but because they were terrified of what the Queen of Heaven would do to any land that took her in. Picture the loneliness of that. The entire world, every coast and valley and field, and not one square foot of it allowed to let you stop and rest. She wandered, heavy and exhausted and running out of time, and every place she approached shrank from her. There's a particular cruelty in being refused not by enemies, but by frightened ordinary places that would have helped if they dared. Leto wasn't hated. She was just radioactive, a danger to anyone who sheltered her, and so she stayed alone with her unborn children and nowhere to set them down. The one place that took her was barely a place at all, a small bare island called Delos, a scrap of rock that floated, unanchored, drifting on the sea, not fixed to the bottom of the world the way real islands are. And because it wasn't fastened down, because it was technically not part of the solid earth Hera had bound by her command, it could take Leto in without breaking the decree, on a kind of cosmic technicality. The floating island that belonged to nowhere offered the homeless goddess the one welcome the whole rooted world had refused. She came ashore on the drifting rock, and there, with nothing but a single palm tree to hold on to, she brought forth her twins. And they were not minor twins, they were Apollo and Artemis, the god of the sun, of music and prophecy and healing, and the clean, far-shooting arrow, and the goddess of the moon, of the hunt and the wild places and the protection of young things, the same Artemis whose stolen face Zeus had used to deceive Callisto, the same Artemis who'd tried to hide Taygete as a deer. Two of the brightest, most powerful gods in the entire Greek pantheon, born on a rock so poor and so small it wasn't even attached to the world, because a jealous queen had shut every richer door. The island was rewarded for its courage. After the twins were born, Delos was anchored at last, fixed permanently to the seabed, and it became one of the holiest sanctuaries in all of Greece, a place pilgrims sailed to for 1,000 years. The poorest scrap of land in the story, the one nobody else dared shelter, became sacred ground because it was brave when bravery cost something. Even the dirt sometimes gets a better ending than the women if it opens its door at the right moment. Hold on to Delos, the floating island that stopped floating, and hold on to Leto, who walked the whole earth alone and was taken in only by a rock that belonged nowhere, and gave the world the sun and the moon as her thanks for the one kindness she was shown. Now let's meet the shy one, because not every woman in this catalogue was a princess in a meadow, and one of them wanted nothing to do with any of it, and got the cleverest son in the world for her trouble. Her name was Maia, and she was the eldest of the 7 sisters called the Pleiades, the daughters of a Titan who holds up the sky. The other sisters we've already met scattered through the night, Taygete, who became a deer, Electra, who hid her face when Troy fell. Maia was the one who wanted solitude. She lived alone in a cave on a mountain called Selene, away from the company of the other gods, wanting no part of crowds or feasts or the noise of Olympus, content with quiet and her own company. Which made her, of course, exactly the kind of person Zeus would visit, because he conducted his visits to Maia at night, while Hera slept, away from notice, in the dark of the mountain cave where no one would think to look. And from those quiet visits came Hermes, and Hermes did not stay quiet for long. He may be the most precocious infant in all of mythology, and his first day on Earth is one of the great comic sequences the Greeks handed down. He was born in the morning. By midday he had climbed out of his cradle, bored, and gone looking for trouble. He found a tortoise at the mouth of the cave, and he looked at it, and in a flash of the cleverness he'd carry his whole career, he saw not an animal, but an instrument, hollowed the shell, strung it, and invented the lyre on the spot, the very lyre that would later pass down to Amphion and raise the walls of Thebes. A few hours old, and he'd invented an entire category of music. Then, that same afternoon, still his first day alive, he decided to steal his half-brother Apollo's cattle. He slipped out, found the herd, and drove off 50 of them. And because he was already the patron of every clever thief who would ever live, he covered his tracks by making the cattle walk backward so their hoof prints pointed the wrong way, and by wearing strange woven sandals that left no clear trail of his own. Then he drove the herd to a hiding place and went home and climbed back into his cradle and pulled the blankets up and pretended to be the innocent newborn he technically still was. When Apollo, who was a god of prophecy and not easily fooled, tracked the theft back to the cave and accused him, the day-old infant looked up with wide eyes and asked, "More or less, how could a baby born this morning possibly have stolen anyone's cattle?" He almost got away with it. The matter went all the way up to Zeus, who listened to a newborn lie to the god of truth with such confidence and charm that he simply laughed, and made the brothers settle it, and Hermes ended up trading his new invention, the lyre, to Apollo to square the debt, which is how Apollo became the god of music and Hermes kept the cattle and the reputation. Maia, through all of this, raised him. The solitary nymph who wanted only her quiet cave ended up the mother of the busiest god in the pantheon, the messenger who never stops moving, the guide of travellers and merchants and thieves, and the one who escorts the departed down to the next world, the one God welcome everywhere because he belongs to the in-between, the crossings, the borders, the roads at night. The shyest mother in the catalogue produced the most sociable son in it, and her sisters, the Pleiades, ended up in the sky as that faint cluster you can almost count, the little misty knot of stars that vanishes if you look at it straight on and reappears when you glance to the side. Try it on the next clear night. They're easier to catch out of the corner of your eye, which feels about right for the family of a woman who only ever wanted to be left alone in the dark of a mountain. Hold on to Maia and the tortoise and the day-old thief. Of all the sons in this catalogue, hers is the one I'd most want guiding me down a dark road, because he knows every road there is, and he learned them all before he was a day old. Let's turn now to the bloodlines that curdled, because we keep brushing against the great cursed houses and stepping away, and it's time to walk into one properly, the most famous of them, the family the tragedians could not stop writing about, and watch it run from a child of Zeus down to ruin. It starts with Tantalus, who we met already, the son of Zeus and the nymph named for abundance, condemned to eternal hunger in the underworld for a crime against the gods so severe it became the measure of all other impiety. He had committed the unforgivable at a feast, an offence against the sacred trust between gods and guests, and his punishment was eternal, but the curse didn't stop with him. It ran downhill into his children and his children's children, because that was the nature of these things. The wrong he did poisoned the whole line, and each generation found a fresh and terrible way to harm the next. His son inherited a kingdom and a curse. His grandsons, 2 brothers, hated each other with a hatred that drove them to acts the Greeks held up as the very worst a family could do to itself, one brother wronging the other so deeply that the wronged one called down a curse on the entire house that would not lift for generations. And from those brothers came the names you might know, even if you've never read the plays, the kings and queens of the Trojan War generation, the family where a father offered up a daughter to get a fair win for his ships, where a wife waited years and took a terrible vengeance for it, where a son was bound to avenge one parent against the other and was hunted afterward by the spirits of guilt for doing the thing duty had demanded. Every generation of that house did something unspeakable, and every one of those unspeakable things was, in a sense, the next installment of a debt that Tantalus had run up at a single dinner, generations before any of them were born. That's the shadow side of descent from Zeus, and it's worth sitting in for a moment, because it complicates the whole idea of the divine bloodline being an honour. To be descended from the king of the gods was to be important, royal, marked for greatness. It was also, very often, to inherit a curse you had no part in earning, to be born already owing a debt, to find yourself doing monstrous things not entirely by choice, but because the whole machinery of your family had been set in motion long ago by an ancestor's crime, and you were simply the latest part to move through it. The Greeks understood inheritance this way, as something you couldn't refuse, blessing and curse arriving together in the same bloodstream. The glory and the doom came from the same source, and the source, very often, was a night when Zeus came down for somebody. Hold on to the cursed house, not as a horror story but as the true cost of the bloodlines everyone was so proud of. The crown and the curse were the same crown. Let's go to Crete, because we left a thread dangling all the way back at the beginning, when Europa's son Minos became a king, and we said something about a maze and a creature and walked on. It's time to follow that thread, because the most famous monster in Greek mythology grew indirectly out of one of Zeus's oldest affairs, and the woman at the centre of it has been quietly defamed for 3,000 years. Remember Europa, carried to Crete on the white bull? Her son Minos became the king of the island, the great lawgiver, the one who after his life ended was made one of the judges of the underworld, weighing the deeds of the departed. A powerful man, a grandson of Zeus, ruling the richest island in the sea, and Minos married a woman named Pasiphae, who was herself the daughter of the sun, a being of divine blood in her own right, and for a while they were simply a royal couple with a kingdom and the usual concerns of kings and queens. The trouble came, as it so often did, from a broken promise to a god. Minos had asked the sea god for a sign that he was the rightful king, a magnificent bull to rise from the waves, and he'd promised to give the animal back as a sacrifice once it had served its purpose. The bull came, white and perfect, more beautiful than any bull had a right to be, and Minos looked at it and decided he wanted to keep it, and offered a lesser animal in its place, thinking the god wouldn't notice or wouldn't mind. The god noticed. The god minded. And the punishment fell in the cruel sideways way these punishments fall, not on Minos directly, but on his wife, who had done nothing wrong at all. Pasiphae was struck with an overwhelming and unnatural longing for the bull, a desire placed on her by a god as a way of getting back at her husband, and there is no comfortable way to tell what followed, so I'll keep it at the edge of the lamplight, the way the Greeks themselves often did. From that divinely inflicted madness came a child that was not entirely a child, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, the being the world remembers as the Minotaur. Sit with how unjust that is for a second. because Pasiphae gets remembered as the monster's mother, as a figure of horror, and almost no one remembers that none of it was her doing. She was punished for her husband's greed, made to suffer a curse meant for him, and then blamed across the centuries for the result of a wrong she had no part in. It's the Hera pattern again, in a different costume. The woman absorbing the consequence of a man's offence and then carrying the shame of it forever after, while the man who actually broke the promise goes down in legend as a wise and noble king. Minos is a judge of the dead. Pacifier is a punchline. The distance between these two reputations is the whole quiet injustice of her story. Minos, ashamed of the creature, had the great craftsman Daedalus build the labyrinth, the maze so cunningly made that no one who entered it could find the way out, and shut the Minotaur inside it, hidden away in the dark at the heart of the palace. And there the creature stayed, fed in the way the grim old story describes, and I won't, until a hero named Theseus eventually came with a ball of thread and a plan, and the maze gave up its secret, and that chapter ended. But the thread we were following runs back the other way, back through the maze and the cursed queen and the kept bull, all the way to a girl picking flowers on a beach who climbed onto a different white bull and was carried to this same island to start the line. Europa's ride and Pasiphae's curse are the two ends of one long rope, both of them turning on a beautiful bull that wasn't what it appeared to be, and a woman who paid for it. The Greeks built their stories to rhyme like that. Hold on to the maze and hold on to Pasiphae, who deserved better from 3,000 years of telling. Let's slow down now. The room should be getting heavier around you, and the stories from here should match it. Fewer details, longer pauses, the energy draining gently out towards sleep. Let me gather a last handful of the names we haven't touched, not to explain them fully, but just to let them drift past in the dark, the way names do when you're almost under. There was Niobe, not the famous grieving one, but an earlier Niobe, said to be the very first mortal woman Zeus ever loved, the first of the whole long line, before Io, before any of them, the one who started it. There's something quietly enormous about that, a single woman standing at the head of this entire catalogue, the first ordinary person the sky ever came down for, and almost nothing else remembered about her. She's a doorway. Everyone else walked through after her. There was Callisto, a name that means lovely flowing, fitting for a daughter of a river. There was Callis, mother of a king named Ethlius, whose line ran on to heroes. There was Protogenaia, whose name means the firstborn, a daughter of the man who survived the great flood, who bore Zeus a son in the world's early days when everything was just beginning again after the waters went down. There was Calm, mother of a huntress nymph. There was Theia, after whom a festival was named, and Othrys and Cassiopeia, and a scattering of others who appear once in some old text, bear a son, give a name to a hill or a spring or a small island, and vanish. I'm not going to build each of them a section, because there's nothing left to build with, only the bare fact of them, and the bare fact is its own kind of eulogy. They existed. The story remembered that much and little more. Let them drift past. And there was the whole shadow catalogue of the ones who were lost entirely, the women the genealogist never even filed, the local traditions that died when the last person who knew them stopped telling them, the festivals that ended and took their founding stories with them. For every name we have, there were surely others we don't, swept off by time the way most of everything is. The catalogue we've walked through tonight is the surviving portion. The full list was longer, and we'll never know how much longer. And that unknowing is part of the proper feeling of this, the sense of a vast crowd of half-remembered people standing just beyond the edge of the light. Before the sky, There's one more thing worth holding still for, and it's the question underneath all of this that we've circled all night without quite landing on. What was Zeus, really? Because if you've been listening closely, you'll have noticed he's strangely absent from his own catalogue. He arrives, he changes shape, he charms or takes or deceives, and then he's gone, off to the next, while the women and the children live out the long consequences he set in motion. He's the least present figure in his own list of loves. The storm passes over and moves on, and the landscape it changed has to live with the change. That's the thing about weather, and the Greeks knew exactly what they were doing when they made their chief god the sky. A storm isn't cruel, not really. It isn't kind either. It simply is. Enormous and indifferent and following its own nature, and the damage it does isn't personal, even when it ruins you. Zeus's desire and power fused into a force of nature, and the catalogue we've walked through is what it looks like when that force moves through a world of people who can be hurt. He doesn't hate the women. He doesn't even, in any lasting way, love them. He notices them, the way a storm notices a coastline, which is to say not at all, and then the noticing rearranges their entire lives. The Greeks didn't make their king a villain, they made him a climate, and living under a climate you don't get to argue with it. You only get to survive it or not, and build your stories out of whichever happens. That's why Hera's rage is so central and so futile. She's the only one who treats Zeus as a person, who could be held accountable, who could be reasoned with or punished or made to change, and she's wrong, in a sense, to think that's possible, because you cannot reform the weather. Her whole eternity is the tragedy of someone demanding moral behaviour from a force of nature, and being driven slowly cruel by its refusal to provide any. She wanted a husband. She got a season that never ends, and everyone downhill from her wanted mostly just to be left alone, and got noticed instead. It's worth pausing here on Hera one last time, because the whole catalogue has been quietly building toward a question about her, and the question is whether she was the villain. She's easy to cast that way. She's in nearly every section we've covered, and almost always as the punisher. The one who turned the woman into a cow, sentenced the nymph to silence, sent the bear into exile, closed every door in the world against a goddess in labour. If you tally the harm in this story by who delivered it directly, Hera's name comes up more than anyone's, more even than Zeus, who mostly arrived, charmed, and left. She did the lasting damage. The cruelty in these myths usually wears her face. But look at where she was standing. She was the goddess of marriage, of the vow of fidelity, bound eternally to the least faithful being in existence, and she could not touch him. That was the trap underneath all her cruelty. She couldn't punish Zeus. He was stronger, and he was her husband, and the one time she did organize a real revolt against him, it failed, and he hung her from the sky by her wrists until she swore never to try again. So the rage had nowhere to go. The one person who'd actually wronged her, over and over for centuries, was the one person she could never reach, and so it spilled, sideways, downhill, onto everyone he touched, because they were the only targets left within reach. That doesn't make it right. The women she punished were innocent, tricked, transformed, exiled for things done to them. But it makes it legible. She was a powerful being aimed permanently at the wrong target by a marriage she never had the option to leave. The Greeks knew this. They weren't simple about her. They made her petty, and they made her trapped, both at once, and they let the contradiction stand, the way real people are usually more than one thing. Now let's do the gentlest thing left to do, which is gather the survivors, the ones who came out the other side with a life still in their hands, because the catalogue isn't only loss, and it would be dishonest to send you to sleep as if it were. Io got there in the end, after the cloud and the cow and the 100 eyes and the long mad run from a single fly across half the world. She reached Egypt, and she was restored, and she became a queen, and her descendants ran back across the sea generations later as heroes and founders. The fly stopped. The horns came off. She got a throne and a long life and a line of children who remembered her not as livestock, but as a foremother. It took everything she had to survive the noticing, but she survived it, and the survival is real and worth holding. Europa became a queen of Crete and the mother of kings, and a whole continent carries her name, and whatever the bull cost her, she did not vanish into a footnote. Danaë and her impossible son washed up alive in a fisherman's net and walked into a saga that ended eventually with the prophecy completing itself far from her. The old king undone by the very grandson the bronze walls were built to prevent, and Danaë herself safe by then, a survivor of a box on the sea. Alcmene raised the strongest hero the world ever knew, and for all the sorrow that came with him, she raised him, lived to see it, was honoured for it. These women paid enormously, and some of them, not all but some, got to keep a life on the far side of the payment. The catalogue has survivors in it. Hold on to them too, alongside the lost ones. The night shouldn't end as if no one made it through, because some of them did. And the warmest survival of all, the one I keep circling back to, is the one that wasn't even the woman's own doing. Semele, who lost her life to a flash of fire and a wish she'd been tricked into, who should have been the most thoroughly lost of all of them, gone before her child was even born, got brought back. Her son went down into the dark and carried her up into the light and set her among the immortals, and the woman who'd been undone by seeing a god too clearly ended up living among the gods herself, restored, renamed, safe. Of everyone in this entire catalogue, hers is the ending that runs furthest in the wrong direction, all the way down and then all the way back up. And it happened because she'd raised, without ever getting to raise him, a son who refused to accept that being loved by Zeus was the end of her story. The room is dark now. You've stayed with this a long time, through cuckoo and bull and swan and golden rain, through the bears that never set and the voice that can't speak first and the queen who never could rest. There's only the sky left and the letting go. Let me take you up there one last time slowly, and then I'll leave you to sleep. So look up, one final time, the way someone did 3,000 years ago on a dark hillside with no lamp anywhere near, and the whole sky thick with stars we can barely find anymore through the glow of our cities. There they all are. Taurus, the bull, the front half of him still swimming after Europa across a sea that ended long ago. Gemini, the devoted brothers, taking their endless turns above and below. Aquarius pouring his stream, the Trojan boy who never aged. The great bear and the little bear, the mother and her son, wheeling slow around the pole and never ever lying down to rest, because a jealous queen asked the sea to refuse them. The Pleiades in their faint cluster, 6 bright and 1 always hiding her face from a city that burned. The peacock somewhere in a courtyard below with 100 old eyes spread across its tail, and further out than any of them, past where the naked eye can reach, the planet that bears his name, ringed by dozens of little cold moons that carry theirs, the whole catalogue lifted up and scattered across the dark, still being named, still being found, 3,000 years on, and not finished yet. They wanted to be remembered. Most people do, and they got their wish in the strangest possible form, not as themselves, as patterns, as stories told in the dark to help strangers fall asleep, which is a kind of immortality the women in those meadows could never have imagined and might not have chosen, but it's the one they have. Every clear night the whole catalogue rises and turns overhead, whether anyone is watching or not, whether anyone remembers the names or not. The bull keeps swimming. The bears keep turning. The lost sister keeps her face hidden. They don't need us awake to do it. That's the comfort in it, finally. The thing I'd hand you as you go under. The sky keeps their watch all on its own. It's worth saying once, plainly before sleep, that they were people, or that the people who made them up were people, which comes to the same tenderness in the end. Someone with a name we'll never know stood under these same stars and felt the year turn cold and called it a mother's grief. Someone heard their own voice come back off a canyon wall and called it a girl who'd loved a boy who couldn't love her back. Someone watched a peacock open its tail and saw 100 faithful eyes that had earned their rest. They were trying to make the world mean something, the way you do when you're small under a very large sky. And the meanings they made were full of grief and full of wonder in exactly the proportions that real life is, and they handed those meanings down so carefully that here we are, in the dark, still holding them. That's the whole human project, really, looking up at something enormous and indifferent and refusing to let it be meaningless. They did that. We're still doing it. You're doing it right now, lying here, letting these old names settle over you like a blanket, and the boy who went down for his mother is still down there somewhere in the deepest version of the story, having gone back to a country he'd already survived, to bring up one person the careless sky had let fall. If you take nothing else from this long catalogue of weather and loss, take him. In a story where the highest power there is never once stopped to care, somebody decided that one of the forgotten ones would be carried home. That's the warmest thing these people left us, warmer even than the stars. The idea that being overlooked by the powerful doesn't have to be the end, that someone can choose to go back, that the dark is not the last word as long as there's one person willing to walk down into it after you. The lights are off. Your phone is dim and face down somewhere you won't reach for it. The whole long list is walked, every lover and every disguise, every bull and bear and shower of gold and lost half-remembered name. All of them up there now, turning slowly over your roof in the dark, whether you can see them or not. There's nothing left on the list. There's nowhere you need to be. The bull can swim, and the bears can wheel, and the lost voice can fade off down its valley, and the one hidden sister can keep her face turned away, and none of it asks a single thing of you tonight. The stars will keep their watch, the way faithful old Argus once did, only kinder, and they'll do it all night without you so you can finally set it down. Let it go. Let them turn. Sleep well. Good night.